Let me get started with the presentation. Topic, as we see right here, is military straight pull action rifles. Going to talk about how they developed, the history of them, manufacture of just military straight pull rifles. There are non-military rifles that are straight pull. We're going to kind of stay away from that for right now. So what we're going to do is talk about straight pull action, how it's different from turn bolt, what are some of the issues that you run into, and then we're going to go into the 4 separate families of straight pull bolt action rifles that were actually used in the military. Okay, they're actually issued to military. All right, because there's other straight pulls out there which we're ignoring. We're just doing the ones strictly that did make it to the military. We're going to talk about the lives of them for each one of them. So I'll start talking about the straight pull action. All right, now the first military bolt action design, the traditional bolt action, the turn bolt, first one really used by military was the 1841 Dreyse needle rifle, which if you remember that, it's a single shot. Needle penetrates a paper cartridge, hits a primer, and the whole thing works. All right, so that was the first turn bolt. And most of the rifles that followed that for military use were also turn bolts. All of the Mausers are turn bolts. So the difference here is the turn bolt basically, well, first let's talk about why the turn bolt was preferred by military over what was otherwise being considered, which is in the 1860s, lever action designs, okay, for military use. Well, yeah, not too many made it to military use, and there are 4 primary reasons. As the world's militaries are looking at arms, they needed something that was rugged. The bolt action is a lot more rugged than the kind of lever action guns. Bolt action handles stronger military rounds. I know there's some exceptions, like the 7.62 Russian and the Winchester that was actually used in war. But short of that, they were mostly pistol caliber carbines that were used in the lever action guns. So bolt action handles stronger rounds. Bolt action is easier to maintain by soldiers. Okay, remember they're out in the field, out in the trenches. They need to take guns apart. They need to clean them, put them back together again. Lever action is not so simple to train maintenance on, without sending it back to the depot for that maintenance. So bolt action much easier and easier for soldiers to understand. It's pretty simple. Okay, it's up, back, forward, down. Pretty easy. It's all they had to do. And the key other reason is the bolt action is much easier to manipulate in any firing position. So in World War I, of course, everything was out of the trenches primarily, other than when they're walking fire. But they're shooting in trenches for most of the war. Kind of tough to have lever actions hitting the dirt as you're trying to operate the thing. So the bolt action just made a lot more sense. Also, what made a lot more sense was the lever action as you open it up and you're hitting the ground with the lever. Dirt's coming up, getting in the action. It's much harder to clean that than it is the bolt action rifle. So, this one? Yes, I did. Yep, okay, so I already kind of described what happens. A regular turn bolt, it's up, back, forward, down. Springfield, Krag, all those rifles, Mausers, all work the same way. So what's happening is the functions that bolt is doing is really unlocking the bolt so it can be opened, extracting when you pull it back the spent cartridges from the chamber, also ejecting that spent cartridge out of the gun. Then it's loading a new cartridge when you push it forward, and it's cocking the firing pin and then locking the action so that it's safe to fire the thing. All right, so up, 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 up. In the case of the straight pulls, it's a little bit different because any of the straight pulls like grab here, this happens to be a Mannlicher, but on this particular straight pull, which is not loaded, there's nothing in here, and the bolt is open. Bolt only being closed, for me to operate the action, all I need to do is out comes the old round and goes a new round, and it's ready to fire. All right, so very simple in order to operate the action, and as long as it's not clogged with dirt, it works pretty well on the battlefield. All right, so very simple to use. And actually, Mannlicher, who came up with the idea originally, certainly for a production gun, he believes it's much faster than operating the bolt this way. Okay, and if you're right-handed, that's actually pretty fast. And you also don't have to be as deliberate of going up, back, forward, down. Okay, it's just, and you're done. Okay, so the theory was, hey, it's a lot easier to use than a turn bolt. It's a lot faster, and that's what they liked about it. So the first action he designed, Ferdinand Mannlicher, was in 1884 while he was an employee, engineer, designer over at Steyr. And again, he thought least amount of physical movements for fastest accurate rate of fire. For me, it's kind of tough because I'm left-handed, so either one is awkward, you know, because they're all right-hand bolts. But if I was shooting right-handed, I can see that it's easier for me to not move the gun as much and just doing this than pulling up and doing this and this. So I can see his point, okay? Kind of makes sense to me. So 4 nations issued military straight-pull rifles, and we're going to go over those individually. And a lot of these rifles ended up going to other nations also, which I'll also touch upon. But the years were 1886 for the Mannlicher, which was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In Switzerland, 1889, with the Schmidt-Rubin design. The U.S. Lee Navy, which was used just for the Navy, but it became their standard long arm, standard rifle. That was 1895. And finally, the Canadian Ross, starting in 1903 is when they first were issued. All right, and additionally, a whole bunch of other countries used primarily the Mannlichers because of the fact that they were war reparations. They got spread all over the place, and Austria-Hungary had a large stock of them before they were defeated. So, key variations. What's different about these guns? All right, all these guns here from the 4 different countries, they have representative examples of each of the 4. What's different is when you pull it back and push it forward, what happens with the bolt? On certain guns, they have a rotating bolt head. Same thing would happen if you were manually turning that bolt, okay? It actually rotates on its way forward and rotates back on its way out. What else is different is the method of locking and unlocking. Well, so some had rotating bolt heads, some didn't have rotating bolt heads at all. The non-rotating design basically was a wedge, and I'll show you an example of that when we get to it. Method of locking and unlocking the bolt, wedge versus helical motion of unlocking lugs. Number and location of the bolt locking lugs, front, center, rear, or none. So some guns had no locking lugs, others had them at the front of the bolt, some in the center, some in the back. And there's certain disadvantages to some of those. We're going to touch on that. Loading the magazine, how to jewel the magazine. Well, it could be via end block clips, and I better grab one so I don't have to describe it. Let me just put a box of them out here someplace. Let me go grab the box, be right back. You do not want to put the live ammunition near the guns. Not that I don't trust you guys, I don't trust myself, you know? So I'll keep the ammo back on the stage here. But an end block clip is like the M1 Garand. Right, in case of the M1 Garand, the entire clip gets inserted into the action. Open the bolt, put the entire clip plus the rounds, push the whole thing down as a unit into the magazine well. Okay, and then start cycling. What happens is the clip stays inside there, if it's an end block clip, and falls out either on the second round or on the last round, depending upon who the manufacturer was. But that's an end block clip holding 5 rounds. So end block clip was one way to do it. Another way to do it was stripper clips. Okay, regular normal stripper clips like we're accustomed to for, you know, Springfields and things of that nature. Where the clip stays outside and it gets tossed aside before we close the bolt. Or one gun had no clips whatsoever. All right, use something called a Harris Control Platform Magazine, which I'll show you. It's kind of interesting, and it kind of worked. Okay, so do they still make straight pulls today? The answer is not for the military. The last military guns are the ones you've seen up here. All right, they basically went away. They were kind of obsolete, really. By the end of World War I, but they soldiered on because there were so many of them, and they weren't that bad, but they were kind of obsolete back then. So who still makes them today? Well, if you watch the Olympics, if you watch the biathlon, do you ever notice how quickly they cycle the bolt? They're not allowed to use a semi-automatic. You have to have a bolt, so they just flick it with their thumb. All right, it's sort of like a Ruger 1022 that doesn't cycle on its own. You just got to cycle it in between, but you can just use your thumb. Okay. So yes, for the Olympics, it is fast. It's much faster than doing a normal kind of a bolt. So yes, that tremendously makes sense there, particularly because the springs are so light in the 22. Also, high-end sporting rifles for hunting. Some very high-end rifles. The price for a new typically starts about $3,000, then it goes up. you know, the more status symbols like Perazzi shotguns, okay? The prices start really high, but not that many of them are made every year. So here's what those clips look like. That's the Austro-Hungarian M block clip. That big, weird-looking thing is what the Swiss use for the entire life of their straight pull rifles. The 303 that looks probably familiar to you guys, that is used by the Enfield and a bunch of other rifles. That clip was also used, stripper clip, was used for the Ross guns. And this one here looks like a stripper clip, it's not. All right, it's actually not a stripper clip, it is an end block clip. It goes down into the magazine. This is on the Johnson rifle. I'm sorry, the Lee rifle rather. We'll talk about that. And there's a couple rifles up here. Well, actually one rifle. No clips whatsoever. Just drop the rounds in. We'll show you how that works. All right, so clips was a differentiating thing. Let's jump into the Mannlichers. Right, Mannlichers was the very first one, and what happened with arms with the Austro-Hungarian Empire? They lost the war very quickly. It was a 7 weeks war in 1866, and they were just outfought, but they blamed it on the Prussians having better arms than they did. All right, because the Prussians had the Dreisen needle rifle. All right, so a bolt-action rifle, still single shot, but very quick to reload. They were using Lorenz muzzle-loading muskets. Yes, those are the same Lorenz muskets that we used in the Civil War. All right, when we had to get arms from elsewhere, like particularly for the South, they bought a bunch of Lorenz muskets. So they're Civil War era type muskets, U.S. Civil War era muskets, which the Austro-Hungarian Empire had been using for quite a while. And obviously that didn't make sense, so time to move on. So they got really nervous because of this, because of the bolt action thing happening. So immediately they said, okay, immediately is a stopgap. Let's take and do what the United States did. We're going to take all of our, not all of our muskets, but most of our muskets, and convert those Lorenz muskets into trapdoors. So it looks very much like a trapdoor. I should have thrown a picture in here, but if it opens just like a trapdoor, opens forward just like a trapdoor. Put it in the round, close it. When you open it up, it ejects the round. So that was good. They got to use all those muskets because they had, like probably a couple million of them that they could use. That was just stopgap though. It's still single shot, and it's still an action not really designed for high power cartridges. So in 1867, same year, Austro-Hungary adopts, took a while to catch up with manufacturer, but they adopted the Werndl 1867 rotating breech rifle. It was developed by Steyr, and they used an 11mm black powder centerfire cartridge. Okay, again, it was still a single shot, and it looked more like a Snyder where it opens sideways, but it doesn't really just open the breech, it actually turns, and then when you load it, it kind of closes, and it's a very strong action, for what it's doing, probably compared to even like the trapdoor, or this the Wanzel breech loader. But it's not something you're going to live with a long time because it's single shot only. So this one too is kind of stopgap. Now Ferdinand Mannlicher joined Steyr in 1877, and in 1880, Austro-Hungary creates a commission to find a new rifle. Why did they need a new rifle? Why? Because once again, the Germans did something. Germans came out with the 7184 repeating rifle, which is a bolt-action rifle, but it had a tube magazine, and you got 8 rounds, 6 rounds, whatever it took, I don't know. But now they had a repeater. Okay, yes, it was still black powder, but they had a repeater, so Austro-Hungary says, yeah, we're not going to get beat again. We got to get ourselves a repeater. So they did a study, and at the conclusion of the study in 1886, they adopted the model 1886 Mannlicher repeating infantry rifle and chambered for that same 11mm Werndl cartridge that was being used here. So that gun actually is this guy right here. Okay, and some of these, this one is kind of as it came. All right, so it's not been rebarreled or anything else. This is sort of the original gun here, but kind of unwieldy, kind of long, and what's particularly long is the bolt. And the action before the barrel starts is really long, all right? Not something you can make a carbine out of, all right? It's just kind of really awkward for that. But it held 5 rounds in an end block clip, put it right in here, close it down. There's a safety right here, which you flick on and off, and then again, just cycle back and forth, all right, in order to operate the action. So, not a bad gun, quadrant sights, which was good because later on when they had to make corrections as they changed cartridges, they just put little new decals, actually little tin things, on the quadrant sights with the new sighting. So it actually worked out kind of well for them. So that was the original. And this is what it looks like. You can't see it from back there, but notice the bolt itself. The bolt has a wedge. The bolt does not have any lugs that lock. It's got a wedge that's actually held against something, and then when you pull it back, it lifts it up and out. All right, so that wedge is okay because we're talking about black powder. All right, so it's model 1886. The later improvement on this was the 1895 family. Actually started with a carbine in 1890, but the bulk of the guns were 1895. And what they did was made a variety of changes. Still used the end block clip. Now it's using 8x50 instead of that 11 millimeter thing. They shortened the bolt dramatically. All right, and now it's a turning bolt up in front, so much more modern looking. They even ended up making a sniper rifle out of it. So what changed from the 1886? All right, initially they said, okay, 11 millimeter, that was a bad mistake. That was stupid. Why did we do that? Everyone else is already going to 8 millimeter or similar. So they said, yeah, we got to go to 8 millimeter. So they came out with the model 1888. The model 1888 was not a conversion of the 1886. It was a new model, model 1888, that took this new cartridge. And they strengthened the action a bit. Now, at that point also, all future rifles were not just built at Steyr in Austria, but Hungary was making political noises because they said, hey, we're the other half of the empire. We want it in our arsenal also. So from that point on, they were manufactured in both arsenals, and they're marked differently based on whether they came from Steyr or the Hungarian arsenal. Then in 1893, they also moved here to a semi-smokeless powder, and they called it the 1888/90. And then they moved to the 8x50 smokeless in 1893. Turns out, though, required no changes to the gun. The gun was strong enough as it was, and required no changes to the sights, going from the semi-smokeless to the pure smokeless powder. All right, so what they still needed to do, though, is improve that locking action. That wedge thing wasn't working so hot for them, so they came out with that Model 95 that I referenced. To start off with Model 1819 Carbine, and then the bulk of the work was done 1895 with their rifles. And those are not conversions, they're newly manufactured. Then the final thing they had to do is convert from 8x56 round nose bullets. This is after World War I in 1930. They switched to model, well, they actually just modified all their guns. They didn't make any new ones. They modified all the guns that they could to take the newer cartridge. Right, a newer cartridge, by the way, when it was the Model 30 cartridge, when the gun was changed, they put a big S, can't miss it, on the receiver saying, yeah, Steyr, we redid this to the new cartridge. In other words, don't fire the Spitzer bullets at guns that don't have an S or an H. H is what Hungary arsenal put on there. All right, so all the variations. Model 1886, 11 millimeter. 1888, 8x50, they reduced the size of the projectile and, of course, the barrel. Then the 8690 and the 8890, they did some conversions of the 86 here, all right, by actually rebarreling it and changing the bolt and all kind of other stuff. So they did do some conversions of that to make the 1886 90 and 1888 90, and then finally that 1890 carbine and everything else after this uses that new bolt and looks exactly the same in terms of the action of the gun. All right, so through World War I, there was also a sniper rifle that was actually fairly popular, based on the 1895 rifle, which is this guy right here. That was fairly popular and a good sniper rifle. And then after the war, as I said, they converted a whole bunch of rifles over to that new cartridge. All right, that Model 30 cartridge. Interestingly enough, what you also had is many countries, many rifles rather, were converted after World War I to 8mm Mauser. How did that work? Okay, when they did that, it was called the 9524, and it was done. Work was done by Steyr and some other arsenals and some other nations, not just by Austria or Hungary, which now were two separate countries. There's also one which is kind of interesting, the 8890-24, and I have one of them here. It was the older rifle converted over to 8mm. It's not really up to it, so all recommendations are, if you have this rifle, don't shoot it. I have not shot mine. All right, so that's what they went through. Let's talk about what we have up here. We already covered the 1886. All right, this one here is actually an 1888/90, which is what it was initially, how it was originally built, and then it was converted to use 8mm Mauser. Okay, that's in 1924. So what they do? Well, they got real creative here. This is a sight, may look a little familiar. The sight is actually, and I've seen a whole bunch of pictures of all these for some reason have this sight. Should look Russian. 1891. That's what they did. They put that sight on there because it worked pretty well with the cartridge. They cut out a place so you can use regular 8mm stripper clips. They rebarreled or bored or rechambered so that it would take the 8mm. But again, this gun, because of the bolt, it's the old style, just the wedge bolt. It said, don't fire it. It was probably given to the troops that never even fired it, but people who were behind the lines. So that's the second gun we got out there. Now here we have a 95-30 short rifle with bayonet, which I mounted the bayonet here. This is a short rifle, not a carbine. Why? Because it's got the stacking lug here, even though they did add on the sides, so you do have a side sling, that basically is a giveaway that it was not a carbine to begin with. Most of these guns were converted. So if we look at this gun right here, this one's actually Hungarian. It says Budapest up on top. It's a Model 95, never converted to Model 30, okay, for the new cartridge, where my old 95 here was. So this one here also, even though it's got the swivels, it was not a carbine originally, all right? The carbines came actually without bayonet lug, and also, actually no, some of the other bayonet lug, but did not have that stacking hook. All right, and the last one here, this one here is the Model 24, and that means it was converted to 8mm. This was either done by Yugoslavia. Let's see if I see the markings. Originally came out of Steyr, so it still says M95M. They added the M, the Yugoslavs added the M to say Mauser. Why they didn't say, well, we got a problem. Mauser, Mannlicher, the first few letters are the same, but they just called it 95M. So this one was converted for 8mm Mauser. These are good guns. They were used in World War II a lot by a lot of countries, and they hold up really well because it uses that new bolt. It's not using the old bolt. And the new bolt is fairly strong. All right, so those are the guns we got up here. And I said I had 4, but actually I got 5 up here. All right, and Mannlicher straight pull rifles, who use them? Albania. Where did Albania get them? They bought a bunch, plus they got them after World War I reparations. Remember, Austro-Hungary lost and had to give up tons of their guns, and they could not manufacture any new guns. So they were kind of stuck with using, the guns they had, but they had to give up a whole bunch of them as World War I reparations. Albania bought some, and they got reparations. Austria, which was a surviving country along with Hungary, they both used this rifle in World War II, and they used it with the S cartridge. So they used it with the converted guns. Bulgaria, they were a big user, both World War I, post World War I, and they also ended up with the 95-24, which is 8mm Mauser. Czechoslovakia and Poland were kind of interesting because they got the gun because, remember, they're new countries right after World War I. They had no guns, so they said, we'll take your guns. Whatever you can give us, it'll be something better than nothing. But both of those guys ended up switching over to Mauser eventually. Once they got caught up, they said, okay, now let's be selective. What do we really want? We don't want this kind of obsolete gun. We want to go with a brand new Mauser. So that's what they did. Finland got a bunch of them because they were also arms desperate for a while. They later sold them to Bulgaria, who would take these guns. They love these guns. Germany used them in World War I. They used them because they captured a bunch in World War I, and from different countries. But also their ally was Austria-Hungary. So there was a lot of interchange there. So they were using it in the original Austrian caliber. And then for World War II, reserves and home guard got to use these. In fact, there's a picture in one of my books of this octogenarian who's home guard, waiting for the Russians to come across the border. Looked like he couldn't even lift the rifle because it was so big. He's a little old man. He was kind of pathetic looking. But anyway, they gave him out, but I don't think they ever got fired. But they were given out to the home guard. Greece loved Steyr, and they took Bulgarian captures into their inventory, and also bought some 95-24s, the conversions. Hungary, I already mentioned. Italy got a crap load because they were fighting Austria-Hungary on the Allied side. So they got some that they captured, plus they got reparations after World War I, so they used those in World War II. Interestingly enough, the Germans, in World War II, when Italy capitulated and surrendered, the Germans on their way out took all of the Austro-Hungarian rifles with them. All right, I don't think they cared for the Carcanos. I don't know what they did with those, but they did like these, and the Italians were still using quite a few of these. Romania used in World War II. Russia experimented for a conversion to full auto. Steyr was actually experimenting with a conversion to semi-auto, which is kind of wild because this bolt was kind of flying back. So what Russia was trying to do was turn it into a machine gun, where that bolt really wouldn't fly back and forth. I don't think anything was ever successful there, though. Serbia, of course, got it as reparations after World War I. And Yugoslavia loved the 95-24 until they moved over to their own Yugoslav Mausers, still an 8mm. So, Austria-Hungary, just between 1914 and 1918, made 3.5 million Mannlicher rifles and carbines. So there's a crap load out there. And again, after the war, many given up as war reparations. Steyr did updates to the 95 to make it 95-24 and to add the conversion of any old rifles, so they fired the newer cartridge, and they did all this stuff for Bulgaria, Greece, and Yugoslavia. Bulgaria joined and built their own modified 18 old M95 rifles and carbines, including the 8x56 M30 conversion, and then rebuilding the carbines rifles and carbines to short rifles. If you remember, in the 90s, there was like a tremendous number of these straight pull rifles that were available dirt cheap on the market. And that's when I picked these up. I'm a cheap guy, so I picked up one of the really inexpensive. Nobody kind of wanted them yet. And the only ammo you could get was the old, ammo that came, and it was corrosive and still expensive and hard to find. But what happened was, they were mostly rifles initially. They took a whole bunch of these rifles and converted them into short rifles, where they shortened them, or into carbine length rifles, which are still called short rifles if they weren't true carbines. And most of these guns did not start off the way they look right now. Most of these changed, other than like this 95. That kind of stayed the same. So the rifles are kind of rare because most of them have been converted. All right, let's move on to the Swiss. Any questions on the Hungarian rifles? All right, and I think I told you to get some live ammo back here, so I'm keeping it separate. But you can take a look at it later, because interestingly enough, what I had was, by accident, I found when I was looking through my ammo, I have some ammo, both which was manufactured in 1938, according to the box in the back of the cartridge. And all but one of the boxes inside, which is just 2 clips per box, were all Nazi marked. Because in 1938, after the Anschluss, the Nazis basically said, hey, you're not going to manufacture with our markings, not yours, Austria. So I actually have just one box. They're both made in 1938. One must have been very early, because it has the Austrian 2-headed eagle, the Imperial Eagle, on both the back of the stripper clip and the back of every cartridge, and also the outside of the box. But all the rest have the Nazi markings, with the Nazi eagle. That's kind of interesting. Anyway, let's talk about Switzerland. 1886, Switzerland was, they had a kind of a cool rifle back then. The Vetterli black powder, it wasn't a single shot, it was a repeater. So way back in 1886, they already had their repeater. And it was a tubular magazine. The Vetterlis were all over the place a few years ago. I don't know if they're still as common at gun shows, but got a bunch of them fairly cheap. But they were replaced. Why did Switzerland want to replace it? Because they said, hey, it's time to go from something which has a really big bore to something which has a more reasonable bore. And also we want to have something that's a repeater but designed for smokeless powder. Okay? So, they designed a straight pull bolt action rifle, had a 12-round magazine, which you'd fed with 2 stripper clips of 6. So you have to put in 2 clips worth to fill the 12-round magazine. A Major Schmidt, who didn't care much about ammunition, was the designer of the rifle, and a Major Rubin, who didn't care much about guns, but he was fanatic about ammunition. He designed the cartridge, so they called the gun the Schmidt-Rubin Model 1889. All right, so an example of that one is right here. Oh, by the way, both Mannlicher and Schmidt-Rubin, along with Lee and Mauser, competed for the U.S. contract in the late 19th century, but Krag won. All right, but they were considered. They were, one of the finalists, both the Mannlicher and the Schmidt-Rubin. So we almost had a straight pull rifle kind of back then. All right, so, and by the way, the cartridge and the gun's basic design was used by Switzerland all the way from 1889 through 1956. And there are actually still some troops who were issued the rifle reservists in like the 90s. All right, so it's kind of amazing long life. So this one kind of a success. All right, so 1889 is kind of big, cumbersome. All right, big 12-round magazine that hangs down pretty far down below the stock. The action itself is very long, okay? Which means, again, can't make much of a carbine out of this, not with the long bolt it has on here. But the bolt was actually very smooth. It's actually a very good quality gun. Everything about it is excellent. I mean, it just feels right, okay? Everything feels right on it. It's got a really nice trigger. And the Smith, and rather the Swiss, are fanatical about accuracy. All right? So we always say, what are the most accurate military rifles out there? Well, Swiss would be on the list, probably along with Finland and Sweden. Of course, two of those three never really saw war. But Finland certainly did. But all those guns are actually very accurate. Right, so kind of big, kind of ungainly, but pretty good gun. Now, they did not convert this gun. So we talked about all the other guns we have, they're all designed from fresh. Okay, so no conversions yet. Right, so primary variants. The ones I have in yellow are the ones I have up here. So model 1889 Rubin. After that, they said, we want a carbine, and we're using these ugly Vetterli things, black powder, we want a real carbine. So they couldn't design one from their rifle, so they went to Mannlicher. And Mannlicher took basically something that was looking like their, one of their early carbines, and they just rechambered it. They rechambered it, so now it took the Swiss cartridge, but using an end block clip. The 7.5 Swiss with an end block clip, and that was just issued only to people that needed carbines, okay? Now, so that was a big one, 212,000 of these big things. Then next was these two guns, 1889/96, that's not a conversion, that's a new gun that had that name, 8996. They made 137,000 of them. They also made, they made a cadet rifle, small quantity, I've never even seen one of these, just like, 8,000 of them. And they made a short rifle, not quite a carbine, but a short rifle, and they made 18,000. I have asterisks next to these three, including the next one, 1905 carbine. Those are the only rifles that really were converted to later designs. Everything else just came out, was used as issued, or retired, okay, or given us, grandpa. And don't forget that they sold a lot of their guns to their civilians, because they were civilian, male, typically served in the military. When they retired after the reservists, they could buy the rifle fairly cheap. All right, and they still can do that right through today. So a lot of these things went out into the public, because obviously these were not just going to sit in a warehouse someplace. All right, so these were transition guns. The big deal about this was strengthening the action a bit, which it did well, but then they said, okay, we want to change the cartridge. And they wanted to change the cartridge from the usual round nose that was being used before then to a Spitzer cartridge. Right, they started using the GP90, which was 1890, the original cartridge, and they came out with a new one in 1911. So they said, nah, we're not going to rechamber our guns. We're going to come out with new guns. They're going to be even stronger, they're going to be even better, all right? But what they did do was, these guns here, and did end up being converted to the 1911 style, okay? So there's two rifles, and I have both of these examples up here. One was made from the factory as an original 1911 rifle. Also, they took the 1896 and converted it, well actually not the 1896, it was the 1889-96. They converted it over to basically a new gun. So if I look at these two guns here, they look identical, okay? This one right here, and this was designed in the factory, it came out as a 1911 model, okay? Now, bolt is shorter, it's actually a much stronger design. But other than that, not that many changes. They did get rid of that big 12-round magazine thing. And this down here, by the way, is not the release. This down here was the magazine cutoff, all right, which they didn't bother with on the later guns. But they have magazine cutoffs, so you'd have to, feed it individual rounds until you said, no, let's go from the magazine. This gun here looks just like the one that I handled before, but you'll notice if you look closely, there's a stitched on piece of pistol grip right here. There's some wood that's covering some holes here that are no longer needed because this is a conversion. They were issued at the same time as the 1911s, and the troop had no choice. Am I getting this one or that one? No, you treat them all the same way. Maintenance is all the same. So it's really one model, but one of them was a conversion. What that means is you can't find any of these anymore. There's like none. I've never even seen a single one for sale. Because right out of the arsenals, they went ahead and converted like every last one of them. These were converted not to rifles, but these were converted to model 1911 carbines down here. I don't have an example of the carbine, model K11 for 1911, but I do have the 1931 carbine, which is the last gun here. Okay, it's really a short rifle, and this is what all troops converted to, all right? So what did they do? They changed the bolt. I have some pictures to show you. They changed the bolt a bit, and the magazine, oh, by the way, they dropped from 12 to 6. Why did they do that? Because when they did studies, it turns out that loading 2 6-round clips is not any faster in shooting than loading 6 and shooting, loading 6 and shooting. So that's why they said, no, we don't need that big thing hanging down there getting caught up. And again, never tested in war because they were never really in a war. But that was a theory anyway. So this carbine here, they made 528,000 of them. And they manufactured them right up through 1958. So okay, from 1931 to 58, they made additional rifles, replacement rifles, like every single year. So this is what most of us think about when we think about, the Swiss rifle. It's the modern one. These other ones here, although these two are safe to shoot with modern ammunition because they were converted for that use of the modern cartridge. This obviously not the case. You have to hand load something, talk to Will, or you'd have to find really old surplus ammo that probably is not that reliable right now. All right, so. Come on. Here we go. Okay, so there's the original 1889, the conversion of the Model 96 to an 11, or just design of the 1911, and the K31. That's the Mannlicher that was actually designed and, not designed, but yeah, designed and actually built by Austro-Hungary, but in their caliber when they needed a carbine to go with that rifle. Okay, so what's different about these? What makes them stronger, weaker, longer, shorter? One of the main things is where you put the locking lugs on a bolt. In 1889, they put the locking lugs way back here and had a really long rotating shaft. For the 1889-96 bolt, they moved it further forward. Okay, and this is what they continue to use in that 1911 style. What they came up with for the K31 is exactly what Austro-Hungary did, which is shorten the bolt and then put the lugs right up front. All right, it was stronger and it made for a shorter gun. Again, the Mannlicher looks just like the other Mannlichers inside because that's what it was, other than the cartridge head toe. All right, so revisions of the life: strengthening action, reduce the size and capacity of the mags we talked about, develop a carbine version, 1905, to replace that Mannlicher carbine, redesign for the GP11 Spitzer cartridge, and then develop a single short rifle to replace rifles and carbines. All right, with just a single rifle. End of life. Basic design was used from 1889 right through 1956. First replacement was called Sturmgewehr 57, not German, but Swiss version of their Sturmgewehr. Ultra heavy rifle. One of the requirements was that it be as accurate as these rifles, the K31 was, and its attack driver. All right. It's also designed for full auto. So they went from having bolt action, never having semi-auto, they went right to full auto, and they did it sort of the right way. They said, let's have a really heavy gun, sort of like a Browning automatic rifle. Okay. Instead of like our M14 trying to make it full auto, they said, let's take this full auto gun and let's also use it as a single shot rifle. It meant it was very heavy, but it was super accurate. Built-in bipod that was adjustable, really kind of a neat gun. So it went right to full auto. What did they do when they retired these guys in 1990, when they replaced it with the Sturmgewehr 90, which is only in 5.56 instead of the 7.5 Swiss. They let the troops buy these and take them home. They're just not allowed to put it into full auto. Right, we're not trusted, but they trust their own soldiers there. All right, so let's move on to third rifle. Third rifle is model 1895 Lee Navy rifle. It's really just one rifle. And where it started off was in 1895, U.S. Navy said, hey, we got all these black powder rifles out there for us and for the Marines, for the Navy and for the Marines. And we want to replace those rifles, which were primarily still either trapdoors or some very old turn-bolt black powder guns. They decided not to go with the Army when the Army went with the Krag, and instead they selected another rifle, which was in the same competition with the Krag originally, which was the 1895 Lee rifle. So this rifle was designed by James Harris Lee, who was also known for his design work on the Remington Lee and the Lee Enfield. So, you know, fairly prolific designer. It was chambered for a weird cartridge. It was chambered for .236 Navy cartridge, all right, which they called 6mm. But it actually is the smallest diameter bullet used by any military up until we switched to the AR-15. No military used a cartridge that small. All the so-called 6mm were considerably bigger in diameter than this. So it's a really small cartridge. Now, this rifle became the first clip-loaded rifle in use by the U.S. military. First one. Why? Because remember the Krag? You couldn't use clips with the Krag. So you just kind of dropped them in there. So this was the first, this particular rifle was the first stripper clip rifle that was, I shouldn't say stripper clip, this was actually an M-block clip, but the first one was actually used by the military. It was also the first smokeless powder rifle for the Navy. All manufactured by Winchester. They only made 15,000 of them, and then they also made like 5,000 civilian versions. Okay, so it's also sold to the public. Right, so this is what it looks like, and that is in its full stock military form. I do not have one of these because they've always been too dear, but Will Jones was nice enough to bring in his, and this one was originally military, and you know, someone sporterized it up here. I know it wasn't you, Will.
The stock was military, yeah.
Yes.
The barrel is military.
Right.
The receiver is a civilian receiver.
Ah, there we go. There's the whole story, yes. So this one obviously pulls up and back when it comes up. It tilts back, it tilts up, all right? So when you close it, it locks, probably easier to show you up here, it locks into that little recess right there, that part of the bolt handle, okay? That's what's kind of locking it closed here. But when you go to open it, well, in slow motion, when I first pull up, it unlocks out of here.
Pull
Really pull it.
Yeah.
This is one danger. If they're not, oh, there we go. No, now it just slid right out. Okay. So, yeah, it comes up and back. Then I would take what looks like a regular stripper clip, like you'd see for an 8mm Mauser, with 5 rounds on it, push it into the gun, and push the whole clip in with it. It's kind of weird because it looks like a stripper clip. After I close it and fire my first shot, as soon as I feed the second round, the clip falls out the bottom. Yeah, I should have told you that's where the clip falls out of all these Mannlichers, except for the 8mm conversions. It falls out the bottom. All right, so the rest of the rounds stay in the magazine until it's empty. All right, so kind of a nice gun. It was a fairly accurate gun, but it only lasted a few years in service. Let's see if I can get it open again. I'm doing something wrong here. Okay. Obviously, I'm not that experienced with that gun. All right, so we saw what it looks like. Let's talk about how it was used. All right, oh, that 5-round clip, by the way, it looks like a stripper clip. It's not. I keep hearing about people making reproductions that don't work. You know, they just don't work. I don't know what they did way back then in 1895 when they designed this clip, but the clips work. They can be reused, but don't try to make one from scratch. It just doesn't happen. Reproductions just aren't working. But it was an end-block clip. Whole thing went down into the magazine along with the rounds. Non-rotating bolt without locking lugs. It uses that wedge for the lock. Bolt handle pulls up and back to release the wedge, similar to the 1895, 1890 Mannlicher, the original one, the opening action. Okay, so used by the Navy and Marines from 1895 to 1900. Saw ground warfare with the Marines in the Spanish-American War, Philippine insurrection, and the Boxer Rebellion. Okay, not used by the Army, but used by Navy and used by the Marines. Light for accuracy, is very accurate and fast reloading, but they had significant board erosion problems, something about they hadn't figured out the right way for high velocity small cartridges to go through a barrel with the right kind of steel compositions, whatever it was, but they're having bore erosion problems where it had to come back in and get rebarreled. Also, manufacturing complexity, not easy thing to build, kind of tough. And also, just like in the Philippines with our .38 revolver originally, it was, hey, it doesn't have man-stopping ability, the bullet's too small, okay? So we've heard that before, but those were the concerns. So what happened in 1900, they replaced it with the Krag. So they said, yeah, I guess you were kind of right all along, we're gonna go with the Krag. And then only 3 years later, replaced it with the Springfield 03, joining the US Army. So it was a success for a short number of years. It did well in battle. It saw a lot more battle than the Swiss rifles did, right? But, you know, good gun, but probably a mistake. They probably should have just gone with the Krag originally. Canadian Ross rifles. Here's the big mistake. Canada, you know, part of the UK, but they were just using in the late 1800s, like everyone else, single shot, black powder, Martini, and Snider rifles. Single round, you know, loading single round, single shotguns, not repeaters. When the Boer Wars came and Canada was called, hey, come help us down in the Boer Wars, the Canadians said, okay, can we get some of those cool Mark I Lee Enfield that you guys have? We want to get those, all right? Can give us some of those, so we'll go fight with that, right? But what happened was the Britons, of course, said, oh, no, you're not quite ready for those yet. We'll happily give you some .303 Martini single-shot rifles. Yes?
The Canadians never really adopted the Martini. They stuck with the Schneider. There were only like 2,500 Martini Henrys shipped to Canada.
Okay.
And they stuck with the Schneider right on up until you get into the Ross and the 303. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, so yeah, they probably were also the second-hand red-haired stepchildren. No, we want to, Snyder's good for you. You're not quite ready for the Martini. But I guess what they're referring to here is that they were used, the author who mentioned this, I think, was probably talking about in the Boer Wars. Yeah, but it wasn't issued as a standard gun the Canadians were using. So, Scottish, why a Scottish person is involved in Canada, I don't know. But Sir Charles Ross said, hey, I got this really cool rifle. It is super accurate. It's a straight pull. I designed it myself. And it's super accurate. People are buying it like crazy. It's a sporting rifle, all right? I'd like to convert it for you to use for Canada's military, because you don't want to get stuck with a gun that you don't want to get stuck with, because they didn't have their own rifle. So Canada said, yep, that sounds good. All right, so what we came up with was the improved Rifle Ross 303. Yes, that's 303 British, Mark I. It was adopted in 1902 and made at the Quebec City Arsenal, actually with a lot of parts made in the United States, but it was actually assembled there and delivered the first rifles in 1905. All right, I don't have an example of that up here because they're very rare. They only made, well, they ordered 12,000, only 5,000 were produced. Okay, and it has all, well, for these first few rifles are very similar. Rotating bolt with two forward locking lugs like the Mannlicher 1895. But what they use for the magazine is kind of interesting, and I'll show you that in a second. However, this gun, when given to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they had horrific problems with it. They listed pages of problems with the gun. All right, work rate as a sporting rifle, but converting it to 303 from a smaller diameter caliper for a military gun, not thinking more about accuracy instead of reliability, they had some real problems with it. So they said, okay, we really need to rework this thing. All right, so it was replaced by the Mark II in 1906, 1907. Mark II is what I have up here. Okay, it's called the Model 1905. Corrects a lot of the problems, but there were still 70 to 90 modifications during its life. You know, it's never got it right. The visible changes you'll see in the picture, and I'll pick up the rifle in a second. But the longer handguard, middle band further forward, different sights, different magazine cutoff, but still no charger loading. So if you look at the 1905, you can see way back here, it's kind of a short handguard, and it's got the it's kind of fairly back here. And also there's this little device right here, which was the magazine cutoff switch. And they revised that with the Mark II. They moved that part, and they also changed the hook here, right here, for dumping the rounds out of the gun. Well, let's talk about this platform, Harris platform, controlled platform magazine. This little lever right here, which is on the gun right here. Okay, when I push down on this lever, if you look inside, you actually see the follower come down against heavy spring pressure. So now, I don't have to do anything. If I'm holding it like this, and I have a handful of rounds, I just dump them in. And then when I let go, the spring again takes over, but I'm not fighting one by one against the spring. All right, so it's a lot easier than loading individual rounds into a magazine with the spring right under the follower, because I'm relieving that spring pressure. So now I can just drop these guys right in there. Still not as fast as stripper clip, but faster than loading individual rounds into the gun. Right, so this was included in the Mark I and the Mark II. But it's a straight pull. Okay, it's fairly smooth when it's clean. Fairly smooth. Okay, and has safety and has the safeties on this side. I forgot how to get the bolt out. But no, safety actually is right here. Yeah, safety's here. I can just slide it over this way, left, right. And this is used to get the bolt out. Right, this little switch right here. But not a bad-looking rifle, and award-winning rifle when it came to competitions, not military competitions, but just marksmanship competitions. Now this one here is kind of interesting because it's all U.S. marked. Huh? Why is it U.S. marked? It's a Canadian rifle. Well, the Canadians never took it to war. Yes, it's a Ross Mark II, the one that's right up here right now. Mark II, model 1905. But right over here, it's U.S. marked. And if I look at the bayonet is also U.S. marked on the scabbard. All right, so what happened there? All right, so let's move on quickly to the Mark III. I'm going to come back to Mark II in a second. The Mark III looks completely different. And there is an example up here. It's this guy here. All right, magazine looks different. Okay, now it actually uses the regular 303 stripper clip. So just put it right in here, push them right through, and it's the same one used by the Enfield. The rear sight now is that nice kind of fairly complex rear sight that is really good for target shooting with multiple apertures and fun stuff like that. Or you can just use the battle sight. So nice gun, looks pretty good. Kind of heavy, a little bit long, but it should have been okay. They changed the safety, so now it's much more flip open safety. And the safety, it's just kind of move it just like that, and the safety's on or off. It's kind of easier. No magazine cutoff on this. They finally came to their senses. Okay, so you can see there's that rear sight back here, folded down. All right, but notice what they did with the lugs, called interrupted thread. Instead of solid lugs, they used interrupted thread. This was a problem. I'm sure it was great for lockup and for accuracy, but not so good when you got dirt in there. So, what was good about the Ross rifles? Number one, for a military rifle, very accurate. Like the Swiss and like these other guys, it's a super accurate rifle. Actually, the Ross Action, and this was from the middle gun, the 1905, that action was used in the winning rifles in the 1,000-yard Bisley competition. The team that won the 1,000-yard competition were using Ross rifles. Okay, so super accurate gun. Also, it was used in the Olympics. The Ross Action was used in the Olympics for competition. And it was also one of the best sniper platforms in World War I in terms of accuracy. Put the good same scope you had on other rifles, this gun was a bit more accurate out of the box. What was wrong with it? All right, not suitable for trench warfare. Why? Because dirt. Dirt gets into the action and you can't clean it. And they actually had jams caused, and you had combat deaths that were documented. Canadian troops that were killed because their guns jammed as the trenches are being overrun, and they're just screwed. The other problem was long and heavy. But another problem was if you put the bolt assembly back incorrectly when you reassemble it, there's a certain test you have to go through in the manual, which you don't mind doing for like maybe a target gun. for a military gun where you're cleaning stuff in the dark, this is kind of hard. If you don't follow the exact diagnosis to show you that yes, it's reassembled correctly, it can actually just come flying back in the head, all right, when you shoot it. So, you know, bad things can happen. There were injuries and deaths. Also, 113 defects reported by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Springs were described as soft as copper by the RCMP, saying the springs are for crap. And again, bolt falls out. Even if it's not falling out because the gun went off, the bolt just kind of falls out. So there, for a variety of reasons, this was not a very successful rifle. However, where was it used? 20,000, like the one I have right here, were bought by the US as World War I training rifles, because we didn't have enough rifles to do training. We never took them overseas. The Mark III is the one that Canada took to World War I Europe. There is some examples of some Mark IIs, but it's not quite clear how they got there. It's really the Mark III, okay? And the Mark III, we made 400,000 were produced from 1914 to 1916. So there was a ton of them made, okay? What happened in the war, as soon as Canadian troops got out there, as soon as they got out in the battlefield and they could find a Lee Enfield on the ground, they picked it up and they just threw their gun in the mud. There's probably loads of them in the mud, you know, at all these battlefields if you dig down far enough, because they didn't like it jamming, they didn't like how heavy it was, and they said, same ammo, I got the clips for it, cool, I'll use the Lee Enfield instead. Also 67,000 of the later Mark IIIB, there were some minor changes to it, Britain bought for World War I home guard use. In 1916 though, so, you know, they brought it out there in 1914, 1915. By 1916, it's withdrawn from service by the Canadian government and replaced by the Mark III Lee Enfield. But the Ross III sniper rifles continue to be favored right through the Korean War. All right, so that was a very, very accurate rifle. Keep it out of the mud, and it works pretty darn well. Also, the Mark III is used by Canadian Navy, and because there's no dirt trenches out in the sea, and the Canadian British Home Guard units in World War II. They probably never had to fire them, but they now had a rifle. So it did get some use, but overall, it was a scandal in Canada. It was a scandal because why did we go with this Scottish guy? You know, we know how to design our own thing, and he took a target rifle. Should have known it's not going to work. And our troops were dying because of poor design, all this other kind of crazy stuff. So you say, which is the biggest failure? It's this one. But in the target shooting world, in the competition world, it's probably the biggest success of these guys. Although the Swiss is pretty good because all their guys, the reservists, all compete in competitions. So, used in World War II, and they used two different scopes, either the 5.2 Warner and Swayze, it was also used on our model 1903. And then 907 were fitted with the Winchester Repeating Arms A5 scope. Like, where was that used?
The A5?
Yeah, 1903?
That was used on the later international Springfield matches. Yeah.
Okay.
1929, 1930, they used A5s.
Yep.
Yeah, and Flicker.
Yeah, so these rifles were very much a success, and it continued in use right through Korea. All right, so we've covered all the rifles. We had two, I think, pretty good successes. All right, the Austro-Hungarian certainly lasted a long time, even after it was kind of obsoleted. By the way, in 1914, right before the World War I started and Austria-Hungary had to change their plans, they were about to obsolete it at that point in time. They're about to shut down the 1895 and go with a Schopenhauer designed gun with a rotary magazine, very similar to the Greek version of that gun. They were going to go with that instead, but then they saw, you know, war began, no, we can't replace 3 million guns, we're just going to go with what we got. And that happened also going right into World War II. But if you're looking for some good sources, there are some good internet sources. I know you can't see these very well here. But there's books which I put the 4 best ones I think out here. One really good one on the Mannlicher, one really good one and inexpensive on the Swiss. The Ross book over there is hard to find and it's expensive. And a lot of it's tedious reading, because it's not just about the military stuff. It's also some contracts and the disputes that were going on, stuff like that. But also, if you've never seen these books, the small Allied small arms or Central Power small arms in World War I. They're good because they go year by year. It tells you what happened with the arms year by year. Okay, these weren't working, they threw these out. These they got from the enemy. So it's actually kind of a good way to watch that sequence. All right, so with that, thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed. And come on up, take a look at the guns. And I'll answer any questions that you have when you come on up here.